In a previous episode of the Interaction Hour, we discussed one potential space that could benefit from virtual reality. A group that included one of our faculty, Neha Kumar, was using the technology in the education space, working with local teachers to develop virtual lessons that showed improvements in engagement and performance. Today, we return to the topic. Virtual and augmented reality continue to be among the most promising technologies, but what they are, what they will become, and where we will benefit is still up for debate. Even more pressing are the potential pitfalls, like privacy, which, without proper vigilance, could be exploited in much the same ways as social media. Today, we'll chat with two guests, Jay Bolter and Blair McIntyre, to find out just what the future is for virtual and augmented reality, and the promises and pitfalls for both. I'm Ayanna Howard, Chair of Georgia Tech School of Interactive Computing, and this is the Interaction Hour. J. David Bolter is the Wesley Chair in New Media in the School of Literature, Media, and Communications, and an adjunct professor in the School of Interactive Computing. He studies digital media in the historical context of earlier media technologies, such as film, television, and print. He has worked for 20 years on the use of augmented reality for education, entertainment, and personal expression. Blair McIntyre is a professor in the School of Interactive Computing. He's also principal research scientist at Mozilla. His area of research is in virtual reality, and he's an augmented reality expert with a particular interest in privacy, the web, and online conferencing. Thank you, Jay and Blair, for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
It's great to be here.
So I want to start out first by understanding the direction. So you both are two individual people. You might have different perspectives. Can you briefly talk to me about what brought you into this AR/VR space and what your interest is in particularly?
Well, as you suggested, and my background is in the history of media, so I'm excited by the prospects of thinking about virtual and augmented reality in the context of the long history of what we can call reality media, media that redefine reality for us. But when I came to Georgia Tech in 1991, I had the opportunity to work with computer scientists, leading edge technologists like Blair McIntyre, in actually putting into practice some of the ideas that I had at a theoretical level.
So Blair, what's your interest?
So I actually, when I started my PhD in 91 as well at Columbia, my advisor just threw augmented reality at me as a project. And at the time, I was particularly interested in the idea of surrounding us in the real world with media as opposed to virtual reality, which created a synthetic world that cut you off from the real world. That was back when VR was in its first heyday. And this interest in bringing media out into the world, whether it's for work, for play, for whatever application, has been sort of the driving force of my interest in augmented reality throughout my career.
So you both mentioned way back. So let's go in the way back time machine to 1980s and 1990s. And, it was, I've read that it was a big time in terms of thinking about virtual reality, big topic of discussion. And so now we're here. We're in 2020. Where are we with this technology?
So the technology has come a long way. Back when I started, and I mentioned that VR was in its heyday. To do virtual reality, very low quality virtual reality by today's standards, would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now we're at the point where you can get a very high quality VR device for less than a cell phone, and that's completely self-contained, does everything, you put it on, can play games, can do training experiences, can visit remote places. So I think VR is finally, especially for education and enterprise here, we can really do things with it. Augmented reality is still farther out. The technology is still moderately expensive at like $3,500 for a display, but is improving rapidly. And the core technical problems that were holding these technologies back are getting close to being solved.
So one is cost. You said has really changed it. The technical advances has evolved. And you mentioned this difference between VR and AR falling slightly behind.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, what do you think has held back the AR then?
I think the big difference from a technical perspective is that we can create a fully immersive experience with VR by using folded optics. So you can put this thing in your head and you can see stuff all around you. With augmented reality, you really have to be able to superimpose the graphics on the world. So it's been very hard to create wide field of view displays that give you this sense of immersion. Potentially more than that, though, is that when you're using augmented reality, sort of by definition, you want to be out in reality, right? You want to walk down the street, you want to walk through a factory, you want to walk through a school or a hospital. And making technology that works in the sort of messiness of the real world is significantly harder than a technology that works in your relatively clean playroom or living room.
So you talk a little bit about augmented reality and virtual reality, but you know what? I just realized we probably haven't defined what AR VR is. We're throwing around like everyone should know. Jay, you want to give us a kind of a definition of what the difference is?
Well, at the simplest level, we could make the distinction as follows. VR replaces the world that we see with another world, a computer graphic world. Whereas AR, augmented reality, as the name suggests, augments our view of the world with more information. So when we put on a VR headset, it completely covers our field of view. Think of the movie Ready Player One. With AR, either as a headset or in mobile devices, there are overlays of graphical information or imagery on our view of the world, but we still get to see the world. And as Blair suggested, that's a whole different relationship that augmented reality defines for us with the world. In this case, you can think of the tremendously successful game Pokemon Go from 2016.
So you mentioned Pokemon Go. Okay, I will have to say Ready Player World. No, Ready Player One. Yes. You know, the book was different than the movie. But anyway, let's go on. So we're at the cusp of these technologies. We are at the point where something like Ready Player One becomes a reality, possibly. What's this actually going to look like? I mean, really? Are we really going to have this world of virtual immersion, augmented reality, where we're walking around? I guess it's not just going to be the gaming space. So what are we looking at?
So I think in this case, it's worth separating virtual reality and augmented reality, partially because of the maturity of the technology, but also because of the way that you would use it. So in virtual reality, as portrayed in movies like Ready Player One, you go into this huge social multiplayer space and you do things with people, whether it's games or learning or whatever. And in some ways, that's close. It's tantalizingly close. There's still the kind of interactions and the way you interact with the computer in Ready Player One. Some of that is really far away, but we're getting closer, and you can go now onto any number of social VR spaces and chat with other people in their avatars and so on. Augmented reality, because of the bulkiness of the technology, because of the need to be out in the social world, it's going to be a while till people are willing to walk around and go through their daily lives with displays on, right? If you look across at Jay, he's wearing a pair of glasses. That would be a great augmented reality display from an aesthetic viewpoint. If you look at a picture online of a Magic Leap 1 or a HoloLens 1 or 2, there's no chance anybody is going to wear one of those walking down the street or going to a baseball game, right? And so I think both of those things are going to mean the technologies will happen at a different rate. In both cases, I think the real power of them will be the social experience. It'll be the ability to be in a space. All three of us could be wearing AR displays right now and seeing, our notes, seeing media that relates to the past, present, and future of augmented and virtual reality on the table in front of us. We could be somewhere else. We don't have to actually be here together to record this podcast. We could be in a virtual space in our home offices talking to each other. And so I think some of that could happen now, but it'll be a while until it's sort of pervasive throughout society.
So this is actually kind of funny to me. You'd mentioned the fact that you would wear glasses, but you may not wear a headset, and that when we really get this working, it'll allow enhanced social interactions. And I would have never thought that half of the people that are walking on the street have their heads down looking at their phones, which is anti-social interaction, and I wouldn't have expected that, say, 15 years ago.
Right.
So this would enhance. It could actually benefit us, I guess, in that way. What other ways? Jay, I want you to kind of think about, and what other ways do you think about AR benefiting us beyond social interaction, beyond, say, meeting colleagues around the world, doing podcasts that from different places, maybe even stopping climate change in its tracks and, living a better world because we're not flying all over the place. What do you think about that?
Well, the climate change issue is really interesting and intriguing. We can perhaps talk more about that. As Blair suggested, virtual reality is further along in its applications than augmented reality, but we already see the lines of development, hints of how both technologies can be used in a variety of fields. So, for example, with virtual reality, in addition to games, there are educational applications. You mentioned earlier, Ayana, that our colleague Neha Kumar has worked on applying virtual reality to education. Architectural visualization, you can imagine architects visualizing buildings that they want to construct and seeing what they look like. We're interested in cultural heritage applications. So imagine going to the Roman Forum or the Acropolis in Athens. If you go now, what you see are ruins, but in virtual reality, we can bring those ancient civilizations back to life. So there's a variety of those kinds of applications that we can already see or are on the horizon. And even in the case of augmented reality, besides games, there are the possibility of, for example, visits to museums that are enhanced by an augmented reality application that tells you more about the paintings or the artifacts. At this stage, it would have to be the kind of augmented reality that's a compromise, that uses your mobile device rather than a headset. And as Blair said, in the future, and it may be some years in the future, we could be wearing glasses.
So I like this. I'm thinking reducing emissions, going to museums. I'm thinking of not having to fly into conferences. Hey, conferences. It means so much more. I'm sold. When's the next VR conference so I can invest my dollar into not attending, but actually remotely attending with my glasses?
Funny you should ask this. So I'm actually co-chair of the IEEE VR conference, which will be happening at the end of March here in Atlanta. And part of the reason I agreed to help run this event was I've been very, very interested in this question of how we can let people remotely experience or eventually attend conferences. And climate change is a big reason, right? I recently flew to Berlin and did the carbon calculations, and the one flight to and from Berlin was about the amount of carbon that my house of 4 emits in 1 month, right? And so, but it's also related to access. There's lots of people all around the world who would love to benefit from these conferences who can't attend, either because of money, because of visas, or because their schools and jobs don't allow them to, right? And so at VR, we're going to be using an online platform created by Mozilla called Hubs that lets you go into a 3D space from any web browser. And if your web browser is running on a VR device, you can go in VR. And initially, we're going to focus on being able to co-watch the live streams from the conference. And also recreate the poster sessions if we can get enough of the non-attending poster co-authors to join in the VR space and present their posters virtually to other virtual attendees. As we look forward, though, it's easy to imagine as the technology, all the technology, the software, the networking access gets better, that more and more people could attend these conferences remotely. And maybe, I don't know how big your favorite conference is. VR is about 1,000 people typically. Maybe 10 years from now, VR will be 200 people in the US, 200 people in Europe, 200 people in Asia, and 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 people connecting online and socializing with each other in all kinds of different ways, right?
Okay, so this just sounds too good to be true. And like with any technology, we always know that there are some hidden pitfalls. And
Right.
so this show would not be the show it is if we didn't discuss, some of the things we need to worry about, some of the dangers of using AR, VR. Jay.
Well, among the potential pitfalls is the question of inequality of access. As with any digital technology, there are going to be there's going to be a digital divide. First, because of the expense. VR headsets are much cheaper than they used to be, than when Blair was referring to the age of research when they were $50,000 or $100,000, but they're still not free. But there are other barriers as well as the cost of the technology. For example, certain people with certain kinds of disabilities may not be able to use the AR or VR headsets efficiently or effectively. And in addition to that, there may be other kinds of social and cultural barriers that make it hard for certain people to use it. In addition to those sort of almost expected issues that arise from inequality of access, there's also the danger of misuse or overuse of VR technology, for example, in certain kinds of training activities. VR is ideal for certain things, but it can lead to a kind of a technological enthusiasm that suggests to people we could, set up a VR classroom when in fact you could do the same kind of teaching online with a traditional laptop computer. We should always look at these technologies and ask, well, what are they actually suited for, or are we using them just because they're cool? And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, there's the question of privacy.
So this privacy, I think a lot about this privacy aspect, especially in the cybersecurity space, social media space. I remember when we first came, I think it was Google Glass. It was a question of, should you allow it in the bathroom? Was that allowed? How does this come into play here?
So I think Google Glass is a great place to start, right? So Google Glass was essentially a heads-up display that had a camera on it and a bunch of other technology. It was an amazing piece of technology at the time and still is. And the thing that bothered people was not just the fact that there was a camera, but that most of the advertisements, most of the videos, most of the things people did with it sort of emphasized the fact that you had a camera that was always on, that could be sensing and tracking. And it really foregrounded this sort of dystopian potential. Augmented reality and virtual reality devices have way more cameras on them, right? 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cameras that are being used to map the space around you. When you do, and it's doing that so that it can do tracking, so we can know where your head is, where your hands are relative to the world, so that the technology can function. When you do augmented reality on your phone, it's taking the video, analyzing it, and displaying it to you with graphics, but that same application can be building a real-time model of the space around you, finding, your checkbook on the table, finding other kinds of things in the room, like pill bottles that tell your prescriptions and things like that. So I think there's this sort of obvious privacy potential that extends just from the same things that concern people about glass, but it goes farther, right? So some displays, and soon all AR/VR displays, will have eye trackers on them, and eye tracking will be really great for the kinds of experiences you might create, because you can now sort of look at something and click a button and interact much more smoothly in these experiences. But eye trackers allow the people writing the applications to gather an enormous amount of information about you. You can imagine situations where an advertiser could put up various product pictures in the room that you're walking through virtually and determine all kinds of preferences and things about you, like your political affiliations, your sexual orientation, and so on, just by how much time you spend looking at different pictures in the world. And then it keeps going, right? You can imagine that if you and I and Jay are having this conversation and I'm wearing an AR display, the cameras are pointed at you. What is being gathered about you? Now, all of this stuff isn't going to happen, right? It could, but I think it's the time right now to really understand what the potential problems are in the privacy space and start talking to lawyers, policymakers, security experts to figure out what the convention should be. The history of social media, where Jay mentioned at the beginning, shows us that if we let the companies sort of gather the information and do what they want, we may end up in a very different space than if we sort of take these issues by the horns right now and try to figure out what should be acceptable and what isn't.
So you more cameras means more data. Eye tracking data, for example, it means habits. And so what I hear is if we control the data or we start asking the hard questions,
Right.
then we're not going to get into the issues that we might have with, say, social media and tracking and Big Brother concepts and this
Right.
scary aspect of data. So I think about, though, the use of this, and you made a little bit of a mention of some of the data. I think about eye tracking, but I also think about us as tracking. Does AR VR do like physically position tracking, like where I am? Am I in front of Starbucks? Am I in front of, like, I don't know, another coffee competitor? And so having ads pop up. Can you explain a little bit more about this?
Well, in fact, yes, location-based tracking is a key feature of what augmented reality can promise, as well as the danger, because if your computer or your phone knows where you are, it can provide the information that you need at that place. I mean, it's the key feature, the key advantage that you have from this technology. But at the same time, it leads to the possibility of misuse, or at least appropriation of your information by companies, third parties in general, as well as government sources. If you think back to the beginning of the social media revolution, Facebook, for example, became available to everyone in 2006. There was a great deal of enthusiasm and excitement about what that could be, and Facebook and other social media grew exponentially throughout those years. People didn't think as hard and as thoroughly and deeply about what were the potential pitfalls, the potential drawbacks of giving all this information to companies, to third parties. And it's only been in the last perhaps 5 years or so that we've begun to have this real earnest concern about the impact of social media on the whole social space and the political space. Most recently in the 2016 election and the aftermath, the use of Facebook targeted advertising and so on to promote political messages and fake news. Now there's a very earnest conversation about all of this. But the problem is that these technologies are now so thoroughly integrated into our society that we're having this discussion where the genie's out of the bottle, and it's very hard to put the genie back in. And what we're suggesting is that AR, especially VR2, are on the cusp of that same kind of explosion. We're back in the mid-2000s with relation to this technology. So now is the time to do this hard and fast thinking, particularly because a lot of the same kind of issues that we already know are present with social media and its ability to track and gather information and then appropriate it by third parties, all of those issues are there in AR and VR. So we're forewarned, and we ought to be wise about using that warning and making use of it now.
So these are big challenges. And you mentioned hard and fast thinking about this, but I guess my question is what can we do? How do we actually mitigate? So we think hard, but what does that actually mean?
I think it would be a mistake to think we can solve this ourselves, especially as a technical problem, right? It's not a question of security. Obviously, we need security. I think we need to bring together ethicists, policymakers, technologists, to really figure out how we want to treat this data and what should be allowed and what should not be allowed. If we think about medical data, there's nothing technically stopping companies from abusing the vast quantities of data that is available about us through our doctors and hospitals and so on. But the law, social pressures, policy prevents these things generally from happening. Big companies don't knowingly, brazenly break the law usually because of the consequences, right? If all of this data we were talking about was treated as protected health information, if all of the information that can be gleaned from your eye tracking data, if it was treated that way, that would push companies who are building the low-level technology, building the applications, and so on, into creating the expectations and the infrastructure that treats that data properly. So I think we need to start talking about that now. Start coming up with policies and social expectations and educating users, right?
Yeah, I would just add that I think Blair's absolutely right that we need a multifaceted approach. We need technologists in dialogue with policymakers, in dialogue with politicians, and in dialogue with people in general, an educational program. It's not as if the technologists can solve the problem on their own, and it's not as if policymakers can do so without the kind of technological know-how to really understand what the problem is, what the possibilities are, which is why it's exciting that the kind of work that Blair's doing at Mozilla in this field is giving a technological underpinning that then can be used for policy.
So it's not just a problem based on the best and greatest technology advancements, but it's also about bringing people together in terms of the social aspect. So if I think about this, I actually have two questions then. One is, how do we educate people then that they do have a responsibility in this space? And then with that education, I'm assuming that also means that there has to be some understanding of social norms or understanding of what's acceptable behavior or not.
Well, but social norms are precisely the things that develop over time as the technology develops. It's a kind of a feedback loop. Think about the telephone. What were the social norms for a telephone conversation when the first telephones were put into use at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century? These are things that have to evolve, but it has to be a cooperative relationship, as I said, between technologists, policymakers, and people, so that this kind of evolution can take place. I mean, to give you a couple of positive examples, Mozilla's browser Firefox is very good at notifying you of the kinds of electronic data that is being or potentially could be taken from you as you browse web pages. It comes up with warnings and says, do you know that the website is trying to do this or it's trying to do that? That kind of technological level is certainly part of this educational process, but it also is going to have to involve, I think, policymakers and legislation, perhaps. Think about, in the case of social media, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations in Europe. In many ways, the Europeans are ahead of us in the United States in terms of providing protections for general social media. We need things like that also for augmented and virtual reality.
So you mentioned this legislation and policymakers, which I think in some cases may terrify technologists. So what would this actually look like?
So I mentioned, one example, which is starting to think of this data in the same way we think of other personally identifiable health information. And so if you carry on from there, all of the other data that these devices can sense, not just of ourselves in that case, but of others, we can build on top of policies that exist now. So if I'm walking down the street, there's a certain set of policies, both legal and social, with respect to what I can expect, right? What I can expect in terms of me appearing in a picture you might be taking of a building, right? If you're inside my house, there's a whole different set of legal and policy and social expectations there. And so these devices, I think, will have to come along with that, right? It's easy to imagine a future where when I go into Jay's house, I take off my AR device, or because we've evolved to that place, there's a button or a mode I can put it in that is don't record things about what's happening in here. Now, I wouldn't want to enforce that technically because Jay and I might have a very good reason for wanting to record information while I'm in his house. But I would want the facilities to be put into the technology to allow the social norms that we develop to be easily adopted by me, by Jay, by other people.
Actually, that's a great example because think about the issue of turning off your cell phone in a theater. We're gradually and haltingly developing social norms for when we are allowed to use our the texting feature or make calls or get notifications on our phones, as a society, we're making that decision collectively. And it's a complicated decision, and it involves conflict. And, you know, when you talk about, well, will the technologists be afraid of legislation? They will in many cases, and there's going to have to be accommodations and negotiations, just as they are going on now with social media in general.
So I kind of like this. The benefits of AR, virtual reality, are definitely there. I can see that. I can see how we're at the beginnings, at least with respect to AR, and a little more advanced in terms of VR, but really letting people know that everyone has a stake in it in terms of ensuring we establish social norms and we don't mess it up like we have started to fix with respect to social media. I thank you. This was a great conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So this was our episode on virtual reality and artificial reality, augmented reality. If you like what you heard and are interested in learning more or suggesting your own topics for the podcast, be sure to connect with us on Twitter or Facebook at IC@GT. Thanks for listening.